So, this morning we moved into the section on research methods, and the way that we're going to approach this morning is we're going to do the first of the four things listed down below during the course of our time together this morning. So the list of items here is what's called an advanced organizer. An advanced organizer is a technique in teaching where you sort of give your students the lay of the land. It's a roadmap, if you will, for the segment on research methods. So this morning we'll be talking about research designs. That will include descriptive research, correlational research, and experimental research designs. That'll pretty much take all of our time this morning. Then we'll talk on Tuesday when we get back together face-to-face in AL 201 about measurement and different ways of measuring things like intelligence or memory or personality or anxiety, and the fact that for those measurement techniques we will need to have good evidence regarding reliability and validity. Then on Tuesday we'll talk about some data collection techniques. So what are the actual tools that you'll use as a scientific psychologist to gather the data that you want to have within your study. And finally on Tuesday we'll talk very briefly about statistics, and I promise there won't be any math or computations involved. It's nothing more complicated than my current fifth grader did back in like second grade. Okay, so we'll talk about means and medians and modes, and that's about as complicated as it's going to get. What I'm going to paste into the chat box for you right now is our list of learning outcomes for this second part of Chapter 1. It begins with learning outcome number 1, which says describe how psychologists use the scientific method, and runs through learning outcome number 5 there, which says demonstrate an understanding of research ethics. What's nice about this list is that fifth one is a good example of a textbook item. So I'm not going to talk in great detail about research ethics, not because I think it's unimportant, but just because I've got a finite amount of time with you guys. But you're going to read about that in the textbook. And I forgot to tell you last week that on the test that we do in this course, of the 40 items that you have on each test, there are always 2 or 3 items that are specifically about what I call textbook-only content. Textbook-only content means it's material that I didn't really talk about in an explicit way during lecture, but it's part of your reading assignment for that given chapter. There'll always be extensions of things that we did talk about. I always try to give you an example or two of how we might go about doing that work for those items that will show up in that textbook-only kind of question. Okay, so let's begin our time this morning by talking about research designs. We're going to take a look at different approaches to designing research studies. But even before I do that, I'm going to do something new and exciting that we didn't get a chance to do last week with you, which is a polling question. So the little check mark up above the list of names is now going to transform into a lowercase a. To answer the question that I'm going to put up on the slide in a second here, all you need to do is roll over that lowercase a and then choose from the drop-down menu A, B, C, or D. So the question I have for you is this. A researcher measured the public's attitudes towards capital punishment via a telephone survey. What kind of research design is that an example of? Is that descriptive research, correlational research, experimental research, or uncontrolled research? Again, to answer, just roll over the little A, B, C, D up above the list of names there. I'll give you guys 30 or 40 seconds to work your way through that. All right, so let's take another 5 seconds to finish up. Now what I can do is toss the results of this polling question to you guys. and there are those results. So 14 of you thought that this was an experimental research design. 13 of you thought it was experimental, 9 said descriptive, and 7 said correlational. So you guys are kind of all over the place right now on the front end here as we approach this question for the first time. All right, here's the deal. I'm not going to tell you the right answer at this point. What I'm going to do is teach you some stuff, and then we're going to come back and look at this question again. So this is an example of what I call a pre-teaching question. Hopefully after I teach you, the percentage of you who got the right answer will jump significantly. So I'm not going to tell you the right answer yet. We're just going to run through the content and then come back to this question. For those of you who are here live, or for folks who are going to view this in recording, there are no points connected with these questions. They're just a way for me, when we're online, to do what I would do in class with a clicker question. Give you an opportunity to see what you know. Let me see what this class overall knows about what we've been talking about, and if we need some additional information about the topic because not many of you got it right, we could certainly do that. So there are no points connected with these questions. Okay, when we do them online, anything we do online has no course points connected with it. Okay, Marvin, you can type your questions in the chat box. Absolutely, yes. These are the kinds of things I'm going to ask you guys to do for sure. So they're nice things to make note of. All right, so I have pulled in here infographic 1.3 from page 23 of your textbook, if you want to make note of that. Page 23 of your textbook has this nice overview of the steps in the scientific method. So we begin by developing a question about something that we're interested in. So here's the question. Grandma always says, count your blessings. Why? What's the impact of that sort of grateful outlook? Maybe that's where my question stems from. Step 2 in the scientific method here is to develop a hypothesis. As you know, a hypothesis is an educated guess. Up here it says it's a testable prediction. Okay, so what's the hypothesis in this case? People who think about positive events in their lives will report greater psychological well-being than people who think about negative events. That's my prediction. Okay. Step 3, let's design the actual study. So I plan a well-controlled study. Data are collected when the study is performed. All right, so in this case, researchers randomly assign participants to one of 3 groups. Group 1 lists 5 things they're grateful for. Group 2 lists 5 things that bug them. And Group 3 lists any 5 things that happened to them. Okay. Then we also survey them each week to determine their psychological well-being. How are they doing in terms of anxiety, depression, and other things like that? In step 4 now, we're going to analyze the data. We're going to organize and analyze the data to determine whether the hypothesis is supported or not. Well, in the middle here it says Group 1 participants reported significantly greater well-being than other groups. Researchers conclude that people who count their blessings feel better about their lives as a whole. Then I'm going to publish these findings in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and those findings may then generate for me additional questions like, does counting your blessings also lead to better overall health? Does it have an impact on things like physical health? That might be the next study that comes through the chute here as I make my way through this recursive process known as the scientific method. So I'm hoping that none of that is new to you guys, and terms like hypothesis and so forth are familiar to you. What we're going to talk about a lot this morning is the various different options you have for how you're going to design the study that you want to do. We're going to talk about 3 major types of research designs. Number 1, we're going to talk about descriptive research, where in descriptive research we're going to describe some phenomena. In the second type of research design, we're going to look at correlational research approaches, where we look for associations between variables. And then in the third type of research design, which is what we'll finish up with in our last 15 minutes or so, we're going to talk about experimental research. Okay? where we actually will manipulate variables. And I'm going to say right here that experimental research is the only one that gives us information about cause and effect relationships between variables. And I'm going to refer to it here and again later as the gold standard of the research designs. It's the best way to do things because we love studies that will illuminate cause and effect relationships in any kind of science. Why? Because in any kind of science, we have theories, and theories are statements about causal relationships between variables. And what we hope to do in any science is to have data that either support or don't support a given theory. And theories that are consistently supported by the empirical research that we do tend to persist and become more prominent and more important. And theories who have causal statements that are not supported by the empirical research studies tend to get tossed by the wayside. So the whole point of this is to say that experimental research designs are preferred because they're the very best ones to help us move the science of psychology along. Now, it turns out that we can't always do experimental research designs, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And we'll talk about correlational research designs as maybe a nice compromise in those situations where we can't, won't, or should not manipulate variables as we would in a true experimental research design. So let's begin up top here with descriptive research. And I'm going to tell you, when we're done, what you're going to need to be able to do with this information is you're going to need to be able to recognize examples, let's say, of a correlational research design, or an example of a naturalistic observation study. Okay, you're going to need to know like the advantages and disadvantages of surveys using self-report measures. So those are the kinds of things that I'm going to ask you to do on test number 1. Okay, not come up with a definition for these terms, but be able to look at and analyze examples of them that I'll give you in the various test questions. So descriptive research, as the name would make you expect, descriptive research is research where we just describe some phenomena. Okay? In descriptive research, the researcher doesn't control and doesn't manipulate the variables of interest. Okay? So in this situation, the researcher has no control and no manipulation of the variables. Okay? So I could do descriptive research by sitting in front of my house and counting the number of cars that drive by over the course of the day. That's descriptive research, where I'm just describing something. Obviously, when we're just describing something and we're not controlling anything and we're not manipulating anything, we don't have any ability here to discern cause and effect relationships. Okay? All we're doing, again, is just describing something. And descriptive research can come in a couple of different flavors. We could do a descriptive research that is a case study. Okay? When we do a case study, we look at one individual and we examine their case in extreme detail. Okay? So I'm going to type on the slide here, N equals 1. N means the number of participants in the study. In this case, in the case study, the number of participants is 1. We might, for example, study someone that we know has sustained damage to a specific area of their brain. And the case study is one in which we describe the impact of that brain damage on their everyday functioning. Okay? So how does damage to, let's say, the amygdala, which is one of the brain parts that we'll learn about in the bio chapter beginning next week, what's the impact of amygdala damage on your everyday function? Okay. We might, in a case study, study very closely someone who has incredible memory skills. They're one of these, memory geniuses at the very top of the distribution of people with different levels of memory skills. What is it that they do that makes their memory work so well? What is it about their brain, let's say, that makes their memory function at such a very, very high level? Okay. So the advantage of case studies is that we can be very thorough and very descriptive of that individual. What's the major drawback to case studies? When we're studying one person like we're describing, what's your major concern about the findings that we would get from a case study? Tell me in the chat box. You don't even need to raise your hand, you just chime on in. Can't report for the general population. So are you saying that what we find with that one person may not be true for everybody? Is that what you're trying to get at there? Yeah, so the issue there is generalizability, right? The fancy term that we use for that is generalizability. It's only one person. Now, what we find with that one person may or it may not apply to everyone else. Okay, we don't know until we look at larger samples. And because our sample is one and only one person, that's a question that's still up in the air. Okay, there are lots of famous case studies in the history of psychology. I'm going to pull in for you guys here this table from your textbook where it lists a number of the most famous case studies in psychology. This is from page 29 of your textbook. I'll run through the first two with you guys briefly. Phineas Gage is a name that we're going to revisit next week when we get together online on Thursday and begin the section on biology. Because his case study told us a lot about what's called the frontal lobe of your brain. It's a part of the cortex or the outer lying shell of your brain. And he had damage to the frontal lobes in that cortex. What was the damage? He actually had a railroad iron, a tamping iron, basically a metal bar, blasted through his skull. Okay, went through the top of his head and was sticking out. It was a pretty gruesome injury. And it damaged his frontal lobes, and his case study suggested that the frontal lobes play a role in personality. Why? Well, the most famous quote, I think, from the Phineas Gage case study is from a doctor who had worked with him before and after the injury. And after the injury, his doctor said Gage was no longer Gage. His entire personality was different. We learned from this case study, for example, that the frontal lobe plays a role in helping you to inhibit impulses, to not do or say certain things that might offend other people or make somebody feel bad or that sort of thing. So Phineas Gage, who was a nice, polite, sort of respectful guy previously, after the injury becomes this sort of unhinged, nasty, sort of irascible guy who would say or do whatever might come to mind. So it changed him completely. We'll also look at the case study of HM when we get to the section on memory. And it turns out that the HM case study is one that highlights really, really clearly for us the very important role that a brain structure known as the hippocampus plays in memory formation. He was a man who had brain surgery to deal with his epilepsy. And after they did what's called a medial temporal lobotomy, which included the removal of his hippocampus, he was unable to form new memories anymore. Does that sound like anybody from a kid's movie that I'm sure almost all of you guys saw? Remember Dory from Finding Nemo? Yeah. Dory is really very, very similar to HM. And if you had any guess what's wrong with Dory, I'd say probably something going on with your hippocampus. So again, these case studies are very thorough explorations of one individual with the big question lingering overhead, the degree to which those findings from that one individual are generalizable to the overall population. The findings may or may not generalize. We don't know until we do larger scale studies. But certainly case studies can be a nice starting point in some area of research. Any questions about case studies? If you do, just click on the hand to raise your hand for me. So on a test question, I might describe somebody doing a case study and say, what's that thing that they're doing in this study? And you'd have to choose case study as the correct answer choice. All right, naturalistic observation is a second way of doing descriptive research, and it involves doing observations in the natural, real-world environment. That's what naturalistic observation is. Doing observations in the natural, real-world environment. So let me just type on the slide there. Real-world observations. Okay? So if I'm doing naturalistic observations, and I'm studying aggressive behavior in children. I might get permission from a school to observe the kids during their recess period. I'm going to do my research while they're having recess, and I'm going to count the number of aggressive or violent behaviors that I see them engage in. Okay? If I'm doing real-world observations of people, and I'm doing a naturalistic observation study of behavior in bars, social behavior in the bar setting, I'm over at a bar in Pacific Beach doing my study. I'm not in a research lab here on the SDSU campus. I'm in that real-world environment. Maybe I'm a researcher who studies couples communication. Where might I go to observe couples communicating with each other? Well, maybe I get people who would agree to let me come and observe them in their dining room or kitchen at dinner time. And I'm sitting there with my iPad, and I'm pushing buttons to count different kinds of behaviors that I see them engage in as they interact with each other as a couple. Okay? Those are 3 different kinds of examples of naturalistic observation. What's the one thing that you give up? In order to be in the real world, what are you giving up that you typically have in a research laboratory setting? What's different? What's the potential drawback here in terms of something you're sacrificing when you go out of your lab into the real world environment? Potentially safety. I wasn't really going down that route, but yeah, potentially. In terms of running this research study, what do you have in your research lab? You guys got it, control, right? So we sacrifice control, right? When we leave the research laboratory. We can't control what happened in the classroom right before those kids came out for recess. And maybe they're all angry because they all got double the math homework because some kids were misbehaving. So we sacrifice some control, but what we gain is a sense that what we're observing is what goes on in the real world. We don't need to argue that this is what goes on in the real world because we're already in the real world. What's the other drawback here? When we're watching those couples interact around the dinner table, any concerns about the fact that we're making those observations? What might the presence of the observer do? I'm sitting in the back of the classroom, or I'm sitting in their dining room, right? They might not act natural. They might certainly change their behaviors. I like what Catherine said there, right? So they might change their behavior. So the observer might change what is observed, is what I'm trying to type there. I did kind of a messy entry there. So the observer might change what is observed. So the kids might be on their very best behavior, or the husband, who normally curses and swears at his wife and kids all dinner long, doesn't do any of that while I'm observing him. Okay? So that's a potential drawback here as well. You don't have control, and the fact that you're observing them might change what it is that you're seeing. Okay? All right. The third approach to descriptive research is to get lots of data via surveys. We're going to use self-report measures. We're going to ask people about their opinions, their attitudes, and their behaviors. It is a really inexpensive way to get lots of data really quickly. So inexpensive, lots of data quickly. That's the good news. What's the bad news with surveys? When I ask you about your attitudes, your opinions, and your behaviors. People lie. Grayson went right to it right away, right? So people lie. You might even put that in all capitals and maybe even put an exclamation point in there. People lie, right? Imagine I was doing a survey research study in my descriptive research design here that involved talking to, maybe doing face-to-face interviews with high school freshmen, and I'm going to ask them about their drug and alcohol use in a one-on-one interview, face-to-face. Are they going to admit to drug and alcohol use in the past month in a face-to-face interview? Probably not. Okay, so we're subject to things like underreporting or overreporting when we go right to the horse's mouth here and use these self-report measures in the form of surveys. Okay, but they are a great way to get lots of data really quickly. You just have to think about how the topics that you're asking people about might affect the likelihood of their responding honestly or not. The other big issue with surveys is, again, the issue of generalizability. What do you think the issue is here? Well, the issue here is when we do a survey, I'm going to draw a little picture up top here, and hopefully you guys can follow along. When we do a survey, generally what we do is we have an overall population of people that we're curious about saying something about. And we draw into our study a smaller sample of those individuals. So P stands for population and S stands for sample. Okay? That procedure, by the way, is what's called random sampling. Okay, I'm going to say more about that later on this morning. But random sampling is the procedure that let's say, the Gallup organization or CNN or Fox News or whoever might be doing political polling surveys now uses to get the 600 or 800 or 1,000 people who are part of their survey about attitudes towards certain political topics or who you're planning to vote for, etc. Right? Random sampling yields me a sample that is representative of the overall population because the goal is to talk to fewer people that are in the overall population and then generalize from that smaller sample back to that overall population. That's what we hope to be able to do. Well, the generalizability issue for surveys comes in when we think about how did you get your sample, right? A sample that responds to a survey that's posted on some website probably not going to be representative of much of anything other than maybe people who go to that website. Thinking about these political polls that are going on right now about the presidential election coming up in the fall, right? What's interesting about generalizability there is the issue of whether those participants in the surveys are registered voters or likely voters. In terms of generalizing to what will happen on the actual election day itself, who do we care more about, or who is more representative of who will actually show up and vote? Is it the registered voters, or is it the likely voters that are really a better sample in a lot of ways? It's the likely voters. I don't care about the registered voters on some level because many of them will not do what? They're not going to show up and vote, a significant chunk of registered voters. So as we get closer, right, to these elections, you're going to see that more and more of those polls are going to be polls of likely voters because they're the ones who say, yes, I'm going to show up and vote on November, whatever the hell the date is, right? The registered voters will include people who will give you their opinions, but they're not going to be bothered to go to the polls and vote on election day. Okay? And on some level, we're talking about generalizing our findings from some election poll to the voters. We only care about the people who are going to go and vote, right? So that's the issue here in terms of surveys, is to think about the generalizability of the findings that you get from your sample, right? So one of the concerns and criticisms of psychological research done with you guys when you do your research participation hours, right? Can I generalize from findings done with mostly freshman college students to the overall population? It's a valid question, isn't it? All right, those are various descriptive research approaches. Any questions about case studies, naturalistic observation studies, or surveys? Make sense? All right, let's talk about correlational research. What's probably the one thing most of you have heard somewhere along the line about correlational research? Somebody probably said something to you at some point and they said, what? What's the caveat or the warning, right? Gabriel's got it. Correlation, or if I could just type, I'd be in good shape. Correlation does not mean causation. Okay, we're going to talk about why in just a bit. Okay, so if correlation doesn't mean causation, why don't we just do an experimental design instead? Well, correlational research is going to be looking for associations or relationships between variables. Well, why do something about associations or relationships? Why don't we instead do a true experiment and determine cause and effect relationships? Good question. The reason that we don't do experimental research every single time, and we do and we do correlational research instead, is when we're looking for these associations or relationships between variables, sometimes we're looking at variables that we can't, won't, or should not manipulate. Okay? So there's an association between these two things. Okay, that's fine, but I don't know for sure that something's causing it. Why don't we just manipulate it? Well, okay, let's say what you found an association between was exposure to child abuse and psychological problems. Okay, you found an association there where kids who were exposed to abuse at home had more psychological problems. Well, if you wanted to show that child abuse causes psychological problems, you'd have to do an experiment where you manipulate the abuse variable and you randomly assign kids to be abused or not. And then you measured their psychological functioning. Is anyone going to let you run a study where you randomly assign some kids to be abused and other kids not? I'm actually asking the question. Yeah. The answer is no, okay, and rightly so. For ethical reasons, obviously that's not a good thing to do, okay? You might be curious about the effects of family income on educational attainment. Oh, well, to show cause and effect between family income and educational attainment, we should randomly assign some kids to be rich and some kids to be poor and live in a box. Anybody going to let you run that one? No. So we don't just give up on studying things like child abuse or family levels of income or other things like that. And instead what we do is we look at associations, right? Is there a connection? How much of this thing have you been exposed to? And how does that associate or relate to this other variable over here? So correlational research, I guess I'm trying to argue here, can be a nice compromise for those situations where, again, we can't, won't, or should not manipulate certain variables. Does that make sense? So we're not going to give up on studying physical or sexual abuse, and we're not going to give up on studying other variables that we're really curious about just because we can't do experiments. We're going to do correlational research designs instead. So what's the story here with correlational research? Correlational research involves measuring whether there's a relationship or an association between two or more variables. So the word you should think of with correlational research is relationship, or again, an association between two things. So I could ask you guys, do you think that there is a relationship or an association between, let's say, attendance and course grade? Do you think there's a connection there? Okay, well, I mean, to show that it's causal, I have to randomly assign some students to never go to class and some students to always go to class and then look at their course grades. Well, we can't tell some students to never come to class. So what we're going to do instead is a correlational design where we say, how much of this attendance thing did you do? Oh, and what was your course grade? And see if there's a connection there. So we're not manipulating anything in that correlational research design. In an experimental design, yes, we would manipulate certain variables. Okay? We might think there's a connection between the number of hours of sleep that you get and your grade on your math test. Okay, how much sleep did you get last night? What was your grade on the math test? Is there a connection between those two things? That's a correlational approach. If it was a true experimental approach, we would manipulate the amount of sleep, and we'd wake up some people after 2 hours of sleep, and some people after 4 hours of sleep, some people after 6 hours of sleep, and so forth. Okay? In a correlational study, we don't do that manipulation. We just measure the two variables and see if there is an association here. Ultimately, what we compute is something called a correlation coefficient, which is denoted by this lowercase r. And that lowercase r measures the extent to which changes in one variable are associated with increases or decreases in a second variable. I will tell you, as an example of a correlation coefficient down below, that the consistent correlation between attendance points and course grade in this course is about positive 0.60. Now, you don't know what the heck the number means yet. How am I going to interpret that? Well, that's what I'm about to teach you. Okay? But this is the correlation coefficient that I have found consistently, semester after semester, that attendance points correlate at about positive 0.60 with your overall course grade. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk about it. Let's go to the next slide and start talking about the correlation coefficient, what's in that number. So this is infographic 1.4, and it is on page 33 of your textbook. The correlation coefficient, as it says here, indicates the strength and the direction of the relationship between two variables, and it has a numerical value that always falls between -1 and +1. Okay, here's the good news. You will never have to compute one for our course. The correlation coefficient numbers will always be given to you. You're going to need to be able to interpret those correlation coefficients. So how do I do that? Well, here's an example down below. A zero correlation means there's no relationship between the two variables. So if you look over on the right side here, we've got various what are called scatter plots. Scatter plots are just graphical representations of the associations between two variables. So when I have a low score here on X, I tend to have a low score here on Y. When I have a high score here on X, I tend to also have a pretty high score on Y. That's a positive correlation. In fact, here's a perfect positive correlation where the correlation coefficient is positive 1.0. Well, this zero correlation scenario is where there's no discernible relationship, right? You see this scatter plot? Any noticeable pattern there? No, not really. Well, that might be a situation where you've plotted out the association between the number of apples that you eat each week and your GPA for the semester. It's not like, oh, dude, if you just eat more apples, you're going to do so much better. Or, dude, you need to stop eating apples because they're killing your GPA. There's probably no discernible relationship. It's probably a zero correlation here. All right? Let's talk about how to interpret these kinds of correlation coefficients, and this is exactly what I'm going to be asking you guys to do on the first test with respect to this part of the content. Okay, so strength and direction. Let's begin actually with the direction of the relationship between these two variables. The direction is indicated by the positive or negative sign right here. So in this case, they're giving us a correlation coefficient of positive 0.73. What does that mean? Well, positive correlation means the two variables move in the same direction. Look at the scatter plot here. As I get more of X, I'm getting more of Y. Okay? So I always do this with my thumbs. A positive correlation means as I get more of X, thumbs up on my left hand, I get more of Y, thumbs up on my right hand. Or conversely, as I get less of X, as I move back this way, I get less of Y. So thumbs down on my left hand, thumbs down on my right hand. So with a positive correlation, the two variables move in the same direction. Okay? So with a positive correlation, it means increases in X are associated with increases in Y, or it means decreases in X are associated with decreases in Y. There's a positive correlation between the temperature outside and the number of ice cream cones that you will sell. Okay? As the temperature goes up, ice cream sales go up. There's a positive correlation there. Okay? Other examples of positive correlation. There's a positive correlation between your high school GPA and your college GPA. Generally, people who have higher high school GPAs, thumbs up on my left hand, tend to have higher college GPAs, thumbs up on my right hand. Right? Conversely, people who tend to have lower high school GPAs, thumbs down on my left hand, tend to have lower college GPAs, thumbs down on my right hand. Again, the thumbs move in the same direction when it's a positive correlation. Other positive correlation examples. There's a positive correlation between the number of years of education that a person has and their income. The more years of education you have, in general, the higher levels of income you tend to have. It's not a perfect positive correlation, but it is a positive one. There's a positive correlation between the number of nice things that you do for your partner in your relationship and how happy he or she is in that relationship. The more nice things you do for her, the happier she is in that relationship. Okay? Here's your positive correlation scenarios. What do you think a negative correlation is about? What happens when we have a negative correlation? Anybody want to take a shot in the chat box and guess? What's the relationship here? The variables move in that opposite direction. There's an inverse relationship. Something goes up, something else goes down. Perfect. So a negative correlation would be a scenario like, instead of looking at attendance points in course grade, what if we counted the number of absences you have? As your number of absences goes up, thumbs up on my left hand, if it's a negative correlation, what happens to your course grade? It goes down, thumbs down on my right hand. The number of years you've been smoking cigarettes, thumbs up, more and more and more years, the lower and lower your life expectancy tends to be. You don't tend to live very long, right? There's a negative correlation between temperature outside and sales of hot chocolate, right? When the temperature goes down, 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 thumbs down on my left hand, what happens to those hot chocolate sales? They go up, up, up. Okay? So there's a negative correlation in that scenario. One final example. There's a negative correlation between the speed at which your car is moving and your likelihood of surviving a crash at that speed. Okay? If you're going 120 miles an hour, thumbs up on the left hand, likelihood of surviving, not very great on my right hand. Conversely, if you're going 1 mile an hour, thumbs down on my left hand, your likelihood of surviving, you're probably going to be okay. Thumbs up on the right hand. Okay. Questions about the direction of the correlation coefficient. How do I find strength? The strength of the correlation coefficient is shown in the number. And the number can't ever be bigger than what? What did we say? Correlation coefficient can't ever be bigger than 1. Perfect. Okay, so here's the way to figure out a question, which I'm probably going to give you on test 1, where I ask you to find the strongest correlation coefficient. Okay, cover the positive or negative sign and find the biggest number. Okay, I'm going to give you a sample scenario here. You're going to have these correlation coefficients: positive 0.16, negative 0.81. Positive 3.93 and negative 0.43. Which of those is the strongest correlation coefficient? It is negative 0.81. Why is it not positive 3.93? I don't understand that. Because it can't be above 1. That's the trickery snuck into this question, right? So the way to do it, again, I'm sitting here right at my screen and I'm placing my finger over the positive or negative sign. Cover the positive or negative sign, find the biggest number, okay? The number closest to 1 without being bigger than 1, because it can't ever be bigger than 1, okay? For the math majors, what are we doing here? When we cover the positive or negative sign, what are we actually doing? We're doing the absolute value, absolutely, right? For the people who are really into math, you know what the correlation coefficient actually is for the scatter plot here? What is it? There's a line depicted here. What is it? The correlation coefficient is simply the what? It's the line of best fit, and it's what of that line? What characteristic of that line? It's the slope of that line. Do you remember y equals mx plus b? Yeah, baby. This is the m. This is the slope of the line that best fits through the dots in that scatter plot. Okay? You won't need to compute anything. Again, you're going to need to be able to interpret these correlation coefficients. That's going to be your job. Let me stop there. Questions about correlation coefficients and how to interpret them? probably a good thing to practice in an SI session. All right. Now, all of you have dutifully said correlation doesn't mean causation. That was something you learned somewhere along the line, and somebody jammed that into your head. I want you to think for a second why correlation doesn't mean causation. I'm going to try to get you there by giving you hopefully a memorable example. And the example I'm going to use is there is a negative correlation between the number of tattoos that a person has and that person's life expectancy. Okay? As we have more and more and more tattoos, we tend to have a lower and lower and lower life expectancy. These are the two variables that we're looking for an association between, and the association we find is that. What kind of a correlation is that? More and more and more tattoos, lower and lower and lower life expectancy. Yes, that's a negative correlation. Now, is the number of tattoos the thing that is causing you to die young? We don't know for sure. It's possible. But what we're going, maybe I like is a good answer. Maybe. Not necessarily. That's another good answer. What I want you to think about, and this is going to be one of the two reasons why correlation doesn't mean causation, is I want you to think about any of a whole host of what we're going to call third variables or confounds that could be lurking out there that could be responsible for this association that we find between having lots of tattoos and not living very long. So what I want to ask you now is give me some examples of some third variables that go along with this. In other words, people who have lots of tattoos and tend to die young also tend to have what else going on in their life? What else are they doing that might be associated both with having lots of tattoos and maybe dying young? Tell me in the chat box. They're involved in gangs, a great way to die young. They are riding motorcycles, another good way to die young. Okay? They're involved in crime, another good way to die young. They're using IV drugs, another good way to die young. Okay? All of these things down below are potential third variables that might explain this association that we find between having lots of tattoos and not living particularly long. Okay? Right? Wouldn't everyone agree that these things generally tend to decrease your life expectancy? So it might be that not be the tattoos per se that are causing you to die young. It could be any of a variety of other third variables. The way that one of my professors in grad school described this was, he said, it's a multivariate world. I love that expression. It's a multivariate world out there. There are lots of factors. And when someone tries to convince you that one and only one thing is driving some outcome, if that outcome is interesting at all, it's probably not one and only one thing. There are probably lots of things involved here. In fact, one of the still top 3 or top 5 memorable moments ever in teaching was when I was using this example in a research methods class over at USD. Oh, God, this has got to be more than 10 years ago. And I'm up at the whiteboard saying, number of tattoos is negatively correlated with life expectancy. What's going on with people who have lots of tattoos and tend to die young? And you got a picture. It's a 20-student class, 19 women and 1 man. And the one guy in the class yells out, hookers, as his answer. So maybe we could capture this third variable cohort of factors under, the idea of risky behaviors, right? If you're engaging in any of these assortment of risky behaviors, those things might be what's driving you towards being more likely to get tattoos, and those risky behaviors probably are also connected with a decreased life expectancy. Questions on that at all? Does that make sense? So this is now going to be explicitly spelled out on the slide here, where we start talking about why correlation doesn't mean causation. So I'll give it to you in all caps. I even use an exclamation point here. Correlation doesn't mean causation. Well, the first of the two reasons is actually down the bottom of the slide here. I always end up doing third variable problems first because in some ways they're a little more interesting, right? The correlation that you do find could be produced by a third unmeasured factor, right? So we found a connection between tattoos and life expectancy. It might be produced by that cluster of risky behaviors. What if we find a positive correlation between the number of churches in a city and the number of crimes that are committed in that city? So a positive correlation means what? Well, it means we have more and more churches, and we also tend to have more and more crimes. So I'm going to run for mayor, and my platform is going to be, we need to close the churches because that's where all the crime is happening, right? Unless you're talking about, like, stealing from the poor box, probably not what's going on here. What's the third variable that is predictive of both having lots of churches and, generally speaking, having more crime? What goes along with those two things, generally speaking? Where you have more churches and you have more crimes, you also tend to have more what? Doesn't even have to do with churches being easy targets for theft. Why do we have so many churches? Larger populations, yes. So it's population size that's the driver here. Generally speaking, where you have larger populations, you tend to have both more churches and, generally speaking, you tend to have more crimes. Okay? Give you another third variable example. I forgot to give this to them in the 8 o'clock class because I always forget stuff that it's too damn early. There is a positive correlation between the size of your foot and the size of your vocabulary. All right. So what's the third variable here that goes along with this association between size of your foot and size of your vocabulary? Obviously, it's age, right? That's what's driving this. As you get older, what happens is, well, your feet get bigger and you tend to have more words in your vocabulary. Okay, easy example of a third variable in that case. So that's one of the reasons why when we find an association between A and B, we don't know that A is causing B. Because there could be C, D, E, F, and G that have an impact on that connection between A and B. Up above here, the other scenario is a directionality problem. Is it A causing B or B causes A? We're not sure, right? We don't know which way to draw the arrows. Is it playing violent video games causes kids to be aggressive, or is it aggressive kids seek out those violent video games? Okay. Here's an example built into the slide. Negative correlation between rates of schizophrenia and social class. We see higher rates of schizophrenia in folks who are in lower social classes. Okay. Could it be that the schizophrenia, seeing and hearing things that aren't present, having delusional beliefs and those sorts of things, cause you to land in a lower social class? Is that possible? I'm actually asking you, is that possible? Yeah, that's certainly possible. Is it also possible that living in a lower social class, you have to live in a box underneath a freeway overpass, could cause the schizophrenia that was sort of lurking in the background in you? Yes, we don't know which is which. What's the only way to disentangle these effects? What's the only research design that will let me show that the arrow goes one way or another? We have to do an experimental design. Is anybody going to let you run an experiment where you randomly assign people to be really rich or really poor? And then you look? No. So we're stuck with this. But at least we can show these kinds of connections and think about what else might be going on. I'll give you one more example here of directionality and third variable. So we're curious here about the association between low self-esteem and depression. Could it be that low self-esteem is causing depression? Yes. Could it be that being depressed makes you feel bad about yourself? Yes. Well, those two are examples of the directionality problem, aren't they? Absolutely. Is it possible, if we think about this in a broader sense, that multivariate world idea, that something else causes both the low self-esteem and the depression? Yeah, what could that third variable be? It could be life events, negative life events. People break up with you, you lose a job, you have financial problems. It could be a biological predisposition towards depression. That might be what's causing the problem, right? We can't know for sure here because we've got a multivariate world and maybe we didn't measure these other potential compounds, these other potential third variables. Does that make sense? Any questions about directionality and third variables? Do you need any other examples of it, or are you in pretty good shape here? Good? All right, here's what I want to do. I want to take about 5 minutes and ask you guys a couple of polling questions to see how this stuff is seeping in or not. And based off of that, we'll figure out what we should do next. So the first polling question I have for you here is this one. Oh, this should look familiar. We did this back at the beginning of class this morning. So take a second shot at it now. I'll give you 40 seconds or so to work your way through that one. All right, let's take 5 more seconds to finish this one up. Awesome. Let me toss the results out to you guys. Oh my goodness, what is that? 38 out of 46 of you said that this is descriptive research. You know how many people chose descriptive the first time around? Anybody remember? It was like 9 out of 43. So the good news is you actually know more now than you knew before. That's my one concern sometimes when I do these pre-teaching, post-teaching questions is there is a chance that when you ask the question the second time, your students know less than they did the first time around. That actually happened one time. What's the key word here for getting this one right? How did you guys know that this was descriptive research? What clued you in here? Yeah, the survey part tells you this is a descriptive research study. Marvin, did you have a question or are you good? While you're typing that in, elaborate on uncontrolled. I didn't even talk about that. That's not even a thing. That's made up. So sometimes I do that. All right, here's another one. This is a challenging one right from an old test. Take a look at it. I'm going to give you guys at least a minute here to think your way through this one about interpreting the results of a correlational study. All right, I'm going to give you guys another 10 seconds or so to think your way through this one. All right, let's see what you think here on this challenging question. Again, right from an old test. All right, most of you think it's C, but not by a huge margin. C says, people's wealth and the aggressiveness of their children are negatively correlated. Second choice would be D, all the above are true. Third choice would be B, the factors that cause something else. I can't see it because of what popped on the slide there. All right, the correct choice is C. Somebody who chose C, explain to me why it's C, and for example, not D. How did you end up with C as your answer choice? Chime into the chat box if you would. No evidence that B is true. Okay, so it's not B. The factors that lead to poverty also cause aggressive behavior. Okay, why not A? Poverty is not necessarily what's making them aggressive. It's a negative correlation. As wealth rises, aggression decreases. Yeah, so C was the way to go, right? As income decreases, aggressiveness increases. When it says here has a negative influence on, what is that suggesting? It's suggesting that poverty does what to children's behavior? Has some kind of causal impact on, right? Causal effect on children's behavior, and that's not the case here when we're doing one of these correlation studies. Good. Any questions about why C is the way to go there? that's right from an old test. Sometimes I take these questions and I put them back on the next test. So you will occasionally see polling questions from our online session or clicker questions that we've done face-to-face appear on a subsequent test. The SI leaders will tell you that, and it doesn't happen a lot, but a couple times a semester, it's a pretty fair bet that that will happen. All right, what do we have left to cover here? Well, I want to talk about the third of the 3 research designs. So this is what we've been working on all morning this morning, these different research designs. And I want to now turn our focus to experimental research, which I said before was the gold standard of these research designs. And let's talk about that in some more detail here. Experimental research, as it says on the slide, is generally considered the most powerful tool. And the most powerful tool is why I call it the gold standard. For determining what? For determining cause and effect relationships between variables. If you want to show that A causes B, you want to do a nice, robustly designed experimental research design. Now, built onto the side here is a statement that experimental research involves 3 steps. It can actually include a 4th step that I would label here as step 0. What would step 0 be? Well, before we do random assignment, there are some studies in which we might do random sampling. So let me explain to you the difference between random sampling and random assignment. So I'm going to do some scribbling at the top of the slide here. So here's my big P population of people that I want to be able to say something about. And here is my little s sample that I'm actually going to include in my study. So let's pretend that the study here that we're looking at is about your class. You guys have a full 500 students enrolled in the class. That's going to be my population. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly sample. I'm going to use a random procedure to grab, let's say, I don't know, 40 people to be in my sample for this study. So I've got 40 students that I randomly sample. What I do is I go to the alphabetical roster for the course, and I go to the website random.org, and I tell it to give me 40 random numbers between 1 and 500. And if you're student number 239, you're going to be randomly sampled to be in the study. Okay? So random sampling is when I use a random procedure to pull people from the population to be in my study. Why? Because via random sampling, I can be pretty darn sure that that sample that is now in my study is representative of the population from which they were drawn. Okay? So random sampling makes my population basically equivalent to the sample that actually participates in the study. There's an equivalence now between my sample and my population. Now I'm going to, as it says down below in step 1, randomly assign those 40 people to the different conditions in my study. And let's say what I'm going to do is randomly assign them to 2 groups. And rather glamorously, I'm going to call them group 1, so G1, and the second group I'm going to call, shockingly, G2. So I've got group 1 and group 2 who are now part of my study. And I've got maybe about 20 students or so in each of those. Well, when I take my random sample and use a random procedure to divvy them up into those groups, that's random assignment. Okay? So random assignment is a procedure where I let chance decide who ends up in group 1, group 2, group 3, whatever. If it's 2 groups like this, I flip a coin. Heads are in group 1, tails are in group 2. Assuming I can make the coin actually flip, which the guy in the Packers-Cardinals game couldn't do, right, when they went to overtime. So I'm going to flip a coin. It's actually going to spin around. Heads are in group 1, tails are in group 2. Group 1 is going to do online quizzes. So I'm going to put OQ for online quizzes. And group 2 is not. I'm just going to write no for them. This is now the manipulation of my independent variable. The independent variable is going to be online quizzes completion. Online quizzes. Basically, it's going to be a yes or no variable. Okay, so yes, you do them, or no, you don't. You're assigned to do them, or you're not assigned to do them. And based off of that manipulation, I'm then going to subsequently measure the effect of doing the online quizzes on a dependent variable. Tell me in the chat box, what should my dependent variable, what should my outcome variable be here? I want to see if doing online quizzes has an impact on what? What's the most obvious dependent variable? Yeah, test scores. Awesome. Let's run with that. Okay. I'm wondering if doing online quizzes has an impact on your test scores. Fantastic. I just designed a perfect experimental design because I've got random sampling of students into the study. I've got random assignment, which, by the way, is going to make my online quiz group equivalent to my no online quiz group. So they're going to be similar in terms of age, student year in school, motivation, intelligence, incoming SAT scores, all of those things that might be potential third variables are evenly distributed between group 1 and group 2. What's the only thing that ends up being different between the two groups? Tell me in the chat box. What's the only thing different now? The only difference is whether they're actually completing the online quizzes or not. Thank you, Alec. That's perfect. Okay? So this is how we get at cause and effect relationships. We can show whether online quiz completion causes an improvement in test scores or not if we do this experimental design like this. Make sense? Let me give you another example on the next slide. This example, again, is further explaining the independent variable, dependent variable distinction. The independent variable is the thing I manipulate in cause and effect terms. It's the cause. So I'm going to manipulate whether you're texting while driving or not. So this is going to be, again, a yes or no thing. Yes or no, texting while driving. And oh, by the way, we're in a simulator. I'm not going to send you out on the roads and possibly kill people because you're texting while driving. So you're either texting or not in a driving simulator, and then I'm going to measure as a dependent variable something. Remember, the dependent variable is the variable that we think depends on. That's why it's called dependent. It depends on whether you've been texting or not. Well, one way to measure the effects of texting while driving in terms of your driving performance would be to look at how many things you crash into while you're driving. Okay, this is the outcome variable. So the supposed effect, or I a lot of times like to think about this as the outcome variable. Can you guys think of other good dependent variables that we could measure here in our driving simulator study? We could count how many things you crash into. What else could we count? How often, number of times speeding. What else could we count? We could count the number of red lights blown. What else could we count? Number of stop signs that you've blown, etc. Okay? How often you're slamming on your brakes, how many times you're swerving in your lane. Those are all great dependent variables. I love how you guys are thinking about these, right? So we think what's going on here is that texting while driving has an impact on all of these different things, okay? Well, we're going to randomly assign people to either text or not, and then we're going to measure these different kinds of outcomes down the bottom. We could have multiple dependent variables. In fact, it would make it a richer study if we went beyond just the number of things you hit, because that's not the only measure of how well you're driving, right? And I like Caitlin's comment about how much you're swerving. We've all been behind people doing that, right? You know they're doing something other than just driving because they're all the hell over the place, okay? That's a great design for an experimental study looking at the effects of texting while driving on driving ability. And by the way, if you don't know this research, that research basically shows that you're even more impaired texting while driving than you are when you're at the legal limit for being intoxicated while driving. The 0.08 number, you're worse than 0.08 when you're texting while driving. So if you're still doing that because you think you can multitask like that, really, really bad idea. That's me preaching for a minute. Questions about independent and dependent variables, or questions about the design of this experimental research approach. Can you tell me what the difference is between random sampling and random assignment? Here's how I would explain it. Random sampling is a procedure to make your sample be really, really similar to your population. Random assignment is a procedure that aims at making the groups in your study really, really similar to each other. So they're similar in that their goals are to make two groups equivalent to each other. They're different in that random sampling tries to make your sample be reflective of your population, whereas random assignment is about making the various groups in your study similar in every way to each other. Okay? And when we get that similar in every way, it helps us get rid of possible third variables that are lingering around, and the only thing that's different is whatever I manipulated as my IV, as my independent variable. I don't think I'm going to give any graphs to interpret, but you should be able to look at a scatter plot like we had back here, right, for correlation coefficients, and be able to tell me, okay, this is a positive correlation because it's got a positive slope. That's a negative correlation because it's got a negative slope, right? As I get more in X here, as I move across, I'm actually getting less and less in Y. Whereas up above here, as I get more in X, I'm actually getting more and more Y. Something like that. All right? Good. We've got about 3 minutes left. What other questions do you guys have here on this big old segment on research designs? Here's how things are going to start on Tuesday when we get together face-to-face. I'll do a very brief review, probably 3 or 4 minutes, of some of the highlights from today. And then I'm going to quickly go into probably 2 or 3 clicker questions in the first 10 minutes to see if you're on top of what you're supposed to be on top of. Part of the reason why I do that is to reward you guys who were here today and to make sure the people who are not here today are viewing this recording sometime between Thursday and Tuesday. Because when I start teaching on Tuesday, I'm assuming you have viewed what we did on Thursday. So I fairly often, probably half the time, at the beginning of the class, we'll do a clicker question or 2 that's about what we did in Thursday's online session. Yeah, Catherine, you can type in the chat box whatever your question might be. And then we'll continue on Tuesday talking about reliability and validity, there's various data collection techniques, and a little bit about statistics. There are no quizzes due today. The first set of quizzes is on Chapter 1. We technically finish Chapter 1 next Tuesday, so the Chapter 1 Learning Curve quizzes are due on Sunday, the 7th of February at 11 o'clock, so 11 p.m. after the Super Bowl on the 7th, which is also my dad's birthday. Yep, you're welcome. Any other questions before we wrap up for today? Great. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording here. Remember, when we're done, I need everybody to click the X button to exit out so that we can make the recording available for your classmates as soon as we can. All right? You have to read the book according to the learning outcomes listed in the back of the syllabus. I'm not going to tell you what to read and what not to read. That's part of the job of being a student in a class like this. You have to be able to run through and figure out what seems to be important and what seems to be less important. All right? All right, I'm going to close things up for now. I'll see you guys either in online office hours at 11 or back in AL 201 on Tuesday morning at 9:30. Thanks, everybody.